final item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 4676 in the name of Margaret Mitchell on the 40th anniversary of Lanarkshire Samaritans, Hamilton. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I would now ask those members who wish to speak in this debate to please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible and call on Margaret Mitchell to open the debate. 7 minutes, please, Mrs Mitchell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Samaritans opened their first Scotland branch in Edinburgh some 53 years ago in 1959. Today, there are 20 branches across Scotland supported by over 1,000 volunteers who take in excess of a staggering 2,500 calls each week. The Hamilton branch of the Samaritans first opened its doors in 1972 at the present Selkirk Place location when, as I understand it, the de Mambro family sold the premises to the Samaritans for the princely sum of just 1 penny. So last month, the Hamilton Samaritans held a special 40th birthday party to celebrate their ruby anniversary, and I'm delighted to welcome to the Parliament Hamilton volunteers Nancy and Christine, who are in the gallery this evening. This birthday celebration offered the opportunity for members of the public, local politicians, as well as families and friends of the volunteers, the chance to learn more about the work of the Samaritans. Essentially, the Samaritans are there to support anyone who is feeling down, depressed, isolated, or struggling to cope. Contact can be made not only over the phone, but by post, text, email, or at the branch. The people who contact the Samaritans are often at their wits' end or at a crisis point where problems appear insurmountable, and the Samaritans are there to make sure no one has to suffer alone. A caller can call once, twice, or however many times they need to, and the conversation ends when the caller is ready. Crucially, the service is a fundamental one, is a confidential one, where people are able to speak freely about any problem that's troubling them, big or small, without being judged. Samaritan volunteers come from all walks of life and are of all ages. Having undergone the selection process, they are then trained to the highest standard during a 6-week training programme. Thereafter, they undergo a 6-month probationary period with a mentor. Hamilton currently has 77 volunteers running its entire service and no full-time employees. The Hamilton office does not operate on a full 24-hour basis, but nationally, the Samaritan service never sleeps and provides support 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, something which would not be possible without the dedication of its volunteers. In 2010, it was estimated that volunteers contributed around 300,000 hours of their time. If the same service had been provided by paid staff, this would have cost £3 million. However, the stark truth is that in human terms, the volunteers' contribution is immeasurable. When the Samaritans are mentioned, the first thing with which they are usually associated is a listening service, but the volunteers also provide valuable services to their local communities. For example, the Samaritans' local community outreach team provides emotional support through their stands at festivals and events, and they work supporting young people in local schools. They also work in prisons operating a listener scheme where Samaritan volunteers train prisoners to become listeners, and these listeners then provide a confidential listening service to other inmates. In addition to this, the Samaritans have links with a number of organisations which work with farmers, including Farm Crisis Network and the Royal Agricultural Benevolent Institution. Due to poor weather, their rural locations and harvest commitments, all of which can leave them isolated, Farmers have been identified as a particular risk group. So the Samaritans, as well as working with its partners, travel to rural shows where farmers attend to take part in exhibition stands. Furthermore, increases in feed prices and low milk prices have added to the financial pressures felt by the farming community, and significantly calls to the Samaritan helpline about financial worries have doubled since the onset of the recession and the financial crisis. Nationally, the Samaritans campaign on a number of issues, one in particular being suicide. In Scotland, there are around 800 suicides each year, and the Samaritans play a key role in the delivery of Choose Life, Scotland's national strategy to prevent suicide. They also provide guidelines for the media and suicide reporting and portrayal, and work closely with Google and Facebook to maintain an online presence. In addition, they have been working in partnership with Network Rail to reduce the number of suicides on railways by 20% over the next 5 years. So what does the future hold for the Samaritans in Hamilton and throughout Scotland? Well, for the Hamilton branch, the next challenge is the aim to move from Selkirk Place to new premises, which will accommodate callers and volunteers with disabilities. The present premises were built in 1874 and extended in 1990 to accommodate a training room. However, given the substantial maintenance and overheads for the building and following consultation with volunteers, the decision has been made to sell. In order to achieve this objective, a major fundraising effort will be required. And more generally, the most immediate challenge for all Samaritans comes in terms of the festive season. This can be a very difficult time for many people. Consequently, across the UK and Ireland, the Samaritans estimate that 193,000 people will contact them this Christmas. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Samaritans are a very special group of people who selflessly give their time to provide a life-saving service. Unlike other emergency service workers, they are not highly visible, but despite this, the service they provide is no less vital. In effect, this is the fourth emergency service. And I'm therefore so very pleased and consider it entirely fitting that today in the Scottish Parliament we recognise and pay tribute to this extraordinary group of people who are the volunteers of a very special service. I congratulate Hamilton Samaritans on their 40th anniversary and wish all Samaritans well during the forthcoming festive period, when they will be very busy for very different reasons from the rest of us. This self-funding charity is truly one which is understated and which deserves our thanks and support for the work they do now and will continue to do in the future.
Thank you very much. I now call on Margaret McCulloch to be followed by Christine McKelvey. 4 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I would like to thank Margaret Mitchell for bringing this debate to the Chamber. The vision and the purpose behind the Samaritans is enduring. They aim to ensure that with some listening and some empathy, fewer people in society will choose to take their own life. The Samaritans, as said by the previous speaker, is a largely voluntary organisation in Lanarkshire, and their service is provided by over 70 volunteers with no full-time staff. I think that is particularly remarkable given the nature of the service they provide and the training that the organisation put their volunteers through. To be able to listen to what someone in distress is saying to you, as well as what they are not, is an invaluable skill in any walk of life. And it takes a particular mental strength and real courage to be able to empathise with people who are going through an experience many of us can barely begin to imagine, and to do so in a fair-minded and non-judgmental way. The very fact that there are people in our community who are willing to give up their own time for others and face those demands is something we should certainly mark and celebrate today. Figures show that while there has been a slight reduction in the suicide rate since year 2000, there were still 772 suicides last year, with the rate for men numbering 3 times the rate for women. 10 years after the launch of Choose Life, and suicide is still most common among young to middle-aged men. In my own personal experience, I can think of 3 cases of suicide, 3 awful, heartbreaking cases of suicide, and each one of those cases involved a young man with their best years still ahead of them. Each of those young men had much to live for, and even if they couldn't see it themselves. While there is still alignment between the thinking of government and the thinking of the Samaritans and other voluntary organisations is in accepting that these deaths can be preventable if only people could realise that they're not alone. We have to encourage people to talk about their thoughts and their feelings more often, not just when they reach that stage when they contemplate suicide. That's a challenge. In one sense, it's cultural change for us because while we are a warm and welcoming nation, we're not necessarily in the habit of talking about ourselves, our vulnerabilities and our health. That is why impartial services who can listen and advise are so vital. Not just the Samaritans, but also other services like Breathing Space and a whole range of advocacy, advice and support groups. I note from the motion that the branch now assists people through email and SMS text messaging as well as through the more traditional forms of communication. That all suggests to me that the service is adaptable and open to change, even though the core principles and the central mission behind the Samaritans has always remained consistent. When Choose Life was launched, the Scottish Executive embraced new thinking and decided that a suicide prevention strategy should not work in isolation, but should be based on promoting public health and mental well-being with the active involvement of key partners. While we still face a challenge as a society in bringing down the suicide rate, I would maintain that the decision to approach this issue as a public health matter was the right one. However, we could also look again at how funding is distributed to partners in the voluntary sector, and we could do more to improve engagement between the statutory sector and the voluntary sector if we are to fully support the crucial life-saving work of organisations like the Samaritans. Presiding Officer, in 40 years, I hope that we as a society have developed a better understanding of suicide prevention that makes us more open and can inform public policy. Throughout the whole period, there has always been a place for the Samaritans and their vital work, and I am happy to join with other members in congratulating them on their service to people in Lanarkshire and indeed to people all across Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Christina McKelvey to be followed by Elaine Smith.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I commend my colleague Margaret Mitchell for bringing this debate to the Chamber? A very timely debate, as she said in her opening remarks. Can I also welcome Nancy and Christine to the gallery too? They gave us such a warm welcome in their place. We hope that they've had a warm welcome here today. Presiding Officer, a 40th birthday is such a significant stage in a person's life. They say life begins at 40. I'm still waiting for 40, so I'm not sure yet. But for some people, Presiding Officer, 40 or just living life is a day and daily struggle. And it's that struggle which the Samaritans help people with. So I was delighted, along with Margaret Mitchell and a number of other colleagues, to celebrate in Hamilton with the Samaritans on the 3rd of November this year. They had an open day to raise awareness of the services and the work that's provided by the volunteers there. They also got some lovely cake as well. The party which they had that day, in which members of the public, politicians and partner organisations attended, we were able to gain a really interesting insight into the work of the Samaritans and how they deliver that work. But we also got a chance to meet volunteers of past and present, which was very interesting to hear their stories of how they got involved as well. Because we tend to forget these are people that are giving up their own time, and it's usually with, all their heart too. We were treated to a guided tour of the building, which some of us know quite well now, but we're also treated to a guided tour of the services that they deliver, which was very interesting, the different stations with the different services they deliver, so it allowed you to separate out the different aspects of that. I was particularly struck, as others have mentioned, with the Shotts Prison Service. In addition to groups of volunteers visiting Shotts Prison, selected prisoners, as Margaret Mitchell have already said, are trained as listeners in an effort to meet the emotional needs of fellow prisoners and so to reduce tension and suicide rates. There is also a process, I believe, for prisoners on release to have a contact to help them cope with the challenges of being out of prison and settling back into life. I was also informed of a service for people leaving hospital who can sign up for a callback service to ensure that they are coping with discharge and that they have the services they need to cope with being outside a protected environment of the hospital. This, I think, is a very particularly helpful service for people who have mental health issues or have actually attempted suicide in the past. As we've already heard, Samaritans work in secondary schools throughout North and South Lanarkshire as part of the Choose Life project, with talks given on self-harm and emotional health. And this is quite a new service, and they're developing that every day. And I think we have some young people involved in that to ensure that they're getting the message absolutely right. But a very, very important message to get across, and very, very relevant, as we heard today with the release of the Childline report saying the unsayable. The number of children getting in touch with Childline because they may be suicidal has gone up by almost 40%. And that's a huge number. Elaine Chalmers, the head of Childline in Scotland, said today that the pressures facing children and young people, particularly girls, are increasing at such a rate some see these drastic measures as the only answer. Boys are suffering, but they are less likely to seek help, and we urge them to do so. No matter how bad things seem, it can help to talk to someone. And if we heard my colleague Margaret McCulloch saying the issue about boys committing suicide, the numbers in Lanarkshire are pretty high, but the work that's been done with Samaritans, I think, would support in bringing that down. I think young men don't talk to people the way girls do, and hopefully having the Samaritans and maybe an anonymous person at the end of a text message or a phone line is enough to help them when they're really struggling. I would suggest, if you're a young person, to please just pick up a phone, call Samaritans, call Childline. Samaritans have published their own report taking the lead to reduce suicide, which actually works alongside the Childline report and looking at how people get to a stage in their life where they're completely at the end of their tether, and give them ideas on how to take that forward. As we've heard, Samaritans provide a free, safe and confidential service. People, as I say, can phone, text or email. They reach out and work with schools, colleges, universities, workplaces, health and welfare services, homeless shelters, prisons and other charities. And as we've heard, it couldn't be easier to contact them. Just in conclusion, Presiding Officer, the last 40 years, as we heard, in Selkirk Place has been an excellent home for numerous volunteers, ensuring that the people of Lanarkshire receive the service to be proud of. But there is now a need to move to a new home, and I hope that that new home will continue to be in Hamilton. I wish Hamilton Samaritans well in their hunt for that new home, and I offer my support in all the work they do. But more importantly, I want to thank all the people who have made and continue to make this service the vital service it is today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I call on Elaine Smith, to be followed by Mary Skelman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start, like others, by congratulating Margaret Mitchell on securing this important debate, and also to apologise that I was unable to make the Samaritans party. But when I knew the debate was taking place, I did contact a friend who's a Samaritan volunteer to talk about some of the general issues. Of course, for obvious reasons, Samaritan volunteers don't speak specifically about the work that they do, and so they tend to be unsung heroes. And it's consequently easy to forget then the vital part that they play in society. Their work can often mean the difference, quite literally, between life and death. And therefore, the chance to commend the work of the Samaritans in Lanarkshire and right across Scotland is extremely welcome. The Samaritans was started in 1953 by Chad Vara, who was a young vicar in London. And throughout his time in different parishes, Chad witnessed the struggles experienced by people. And he made particular reference to one example of a parishioner who took her own life. And this particularly struck me. She was a young girl of 14 years of age, and she'd started her menstrual period, and she didn't know what was happening to her. She'd no one to speak to, and she feared that she had a disease. And Chad felt that this tragic loss of a young life could have been prevented if only she had had someone that she could have talked to. Chad Vara was later inspired to set up a phone line and a face-to-face service, and over time he was amazed by the number of people who wanted to speak with strangers about their problems. Now, although Chad was a vicar, I would emphasise that the Samaritans are not religiously affiliated, and whilst volunteers can listen, they can't advise, and therefore it's imperative that there are services in place to back up the work of the Samaritans. And it's concerning, therefore, at this time of austerity, that some of these services are under threat at the moment. Many of those who contact the Samaritans suffer from emotional distress and mental ill health, and I'm told that addicts, including drugs, alcohol and gambling addicts, make up a large percentage of those who contact the charity. And as Margaret Mitchell mentioned, the current economic downturn is no doubt having a detrimental impact on mental health and well-being, and we know that high unemployment rates have a bearing on suicide rates. And that's the kinds of pressure that can then drive people to considering suicide. And in addition to that, I just want to mention companies like Wonga and QuickQuid, because these people are taking advantage of people's vulnerabilities. They're charging up to 4,000% interest rates a year on payday loans. And there are other companies as well who are offering access to online bingo services, and this is becoming a huge problem in society. People are developing gambling addictions very easily because of this. And unfortunately, those kinds of issues drive people into the kinds of debt that then suicide may seem to be the only way out. And these are some of the people who need the care, support and listening ear given to them by the Samaritans. I think, as Margaret said, the Samaritans' work can only increase, I think, at the moment because of the austerity and the economic situation that we're in. And of course, the Samaritans are not the only charity to carry out this type of work. Christina McKelvey mentioned it today. Childline had released figures, and those figures also demonstrated a rise in 13 to 16-year-olds contacting Childline about self-harm. And websites glorifying self-harm were thought to be part of the reason for this rise, and I think similar trends will also be seen by the Samaritans. Presiding Officer, in Lanarkshire, we've got the only health board area whose suicide rates have consistently risen, while all others have come down, and that's a very worrying exception to the national trend. And of course, while those considering suicide are not the only callers to the Samaritans, actually such calls make up about 20%, it's nonetheless essential that we have services like the Samaritans in areas like Lanarkshire to help people who are feeling suicidal and point them in the direction of professional help and services. Over the past 40 years since the Samaritans opened in Lanarkshire, thousands upon thousands of people in my own constituency will have benefited from this service, which is quite literally life-saving. And I want to take this opportunity to wish the Lanarkshire Samaritans a happy 40th anniversary and once again commend my colleague Margaret Mitchell on securing the debate.
Many thanks. Now Colin Mary Scanlon, after which we will move to the Minister to close the debate.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would also like to thank my colleague Margaret Mitchell for giving us the opportunity to put on record the excellent work carried out by the volunteers at Samaritans in Hamilton and replicated throughout the whole of Scotland. I think it's also worth mentioning the Choose Live strategy, which was set up by the previous Liberal Labour Scottish Executive, and although there's still more work to do, I don't think we can have a debate on this topic without looking at the public money and the commitment that is there, both previously and with the current Scottish Government. But my perception of the Samaritan service is that it is uniquely for people who are at risk of taking their own life. Although I know from a friend who is a volunteer that conversations cover a much wider spectrum from debt, sexuality, bullying and family issues through to addictions, as mentioned by Elaine Smith. And I would particularly like to commend the Samaritans on their website. In particular, I found a page headed "Worried about Someone." And there are times when we know that someone may need support, but it's difficult to open that conversation. And it's also difficult to understand when someone may be struggling to cope. The list of signs when someone may need support is helpful, as well as the advice on the website entitled "How to Start a Difficult Conversation." And I think we can possibly all benefit from that. But I know that many parents, families and friends would welcome this advice on how to engage in conversations without being seen as putting pressure on people. So I think There are many lessons to be learned from what the Samaritans do. So already in my very minimal research for this debate, I learned that Samaritans is not only for people at risk of suicide, and they give wonderful advice which could be beneficial to a wide range of people, those at risk of taking their lives, but also people potentially at risk. As Margaret Mitchell said, the work in partnership with Network Rail is absolutely tremendous, as seen in this publication, Men and Suicide. And as Margaret McCulloch said, male suicide rates remain 3 times higher than female. But I was surprised because I tended to think the male suicide rate was 15 to 24. In actual fact, 35 to 44 is twice as high as a percentage, and it does say that there's a growing risk to men in middle age as opposed to the younger men. I also understood that Samaritans was only or mainly a telephone helpline. However, I hope you'll forgive me that I looked up Samaritan services in the Highlands and Islands, and I noted the Western Isles are open to receive callers at the door for face-to-face meetings on 2 days every week. I didn't realise this happened. And I would like to welcome also the new home for the Western Isles branch, a new purpose-built premises in Stornoway, thanks to the generous support of the local community, NHS Western Isles, Choose Life, the Council, Ganachie Trust, Russell Trust and PF Charitable Trust, Garfield Weston Foundation, as well as donations from local councillors and fundraising by staff at the Stornoway Gazette, who fully supported their campaign. The Western Isles is the smallest branch in the UK, and after 18 years in rented premises, now own their own property. I welcome their ongoing commitment to suicide survivors with the monthly support group meetings. So again, it's not only the phone call to the Samaritans, there is longer-term support and the opportunity to share concerns with others who understand. I also understand that the Samaritans have identified Oban as a place where their support is needed, given the remote rural location, isolation and the lack of access to any service at the moment. There is no physical branch of Samaritans within 90 miles of the Argyll area. So, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I hope that the pilot work being done by Samaritans in Oban and the surrounding area will result in a Samaritan service being set up to offer the confidential, non-judgmental support that is available elsewhere in Scotland. And I will certainly be doing all I can to support the setting up of this service.
Thank you very much. I now call on Michael Matheson, the Minister, 7 minutes to wind up the debate, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I, like others, congratulate Margaret Mitchell in securing time for this debate, a debate which I think has been very helpful in being able to highlight the excellent work that's undertaken by the Samaritans nationally within Scotland since the 1950s, and in particular to join in the celebrations of 40 years of Samaritan activity within the Lanarkshire area. I, like all members in this chamber, I've got no doubt, recognise the importance of the work which is undertaken by the Samaritans, both locally in Lanarkshire and nationally across the country, helping people who may be going through difficult times. And I know that the public also see the Samaritans as a highly valuable service, and I think to a large extent the Samaritans have a fairly unique position within our society, unique on the basis that I believe it's an organisation which carries a lot of public trust because of the role which they fulfil. In Lanarkshire, Samaritans have some 80 trained volunteers answering some 18,000 calls for help each year. And these are calls which are taken by volunteers and support which is offered by volunteers to individuals who are feeling low or struggling. And like others, I would like to offer my warm welcome to Nancy and Christine, who are in the chamber with us here tonight. The Lanarkshire branch also works very closely with our Choose Life team across Lanarkshire. And this close partnership has been very successful in raising a whole range of awareness programmes around suicide prevention locally. As a government, we have also provided core grant funding to the Samaritans at a national level for a number of years now. In addition, we've also provided some one-off grant funding to them over the last couple of years. Firstly, to support some early work in developing a new telephony system, which, once completed, will ensure that people calling the Samaritans can speak to someone even at a busy time, by the system redirecting them to a free call in another establishment. And secondly, we've also provided some support to a system in doing work with Citizens Advice Scotland on suicide risk awareness, which is designed to help bureau staff identify and support clients who may be at risk of suicide, and to help bureau managers to support their advisors in handling such distressing contacts. And I think this work with the Citizens Advice Scotland, and also the work they do in prisons and other areas, just shows the variety of work that the Samaritans undertake over and above the call service which they also provide. I want to look more widely at some of the suicide prevention work that's been taking place in Scotland that several members have made reference to. And in recent years, there has been an overall downward trend in suicide rates, with an overall decrease of just under 17% in suicide in Scotland. Therefore, that reflects that we have largely met the planned reduction that was set under the Choose Life strategy. However, like Elaine Smith has highlighted and others have highlighted, there is certainly much more we need to do in reducing suicides in Scotland, and during periods of economic difficulty, we know that that causes greater difficulty in this area in itself. There are also emerging evidence that highlights that some of the factors that may contribute towards someone possibly being vulnerable to committing suicide are very closely associated with the similar factors that contribute to health inequalities in Scotland, which mean that we have to take a much more holistic approach about how we look at dealing with some of these issues. Alongside the Choose Life programme, recently NHS Health Scotland have also launched a new campaign activity called Reading Between the Lines. And the purpose behind this particular initiative is to help to support those individuals who may be presented by someone who are exhibiting risk signs of possibly committing suicide, and to help to support that individual in knowing what they should do in those circumstances to help to support that individual and to feel confident in the way in which they can support them and assist them at that particular point. Another key part of the Choose Life strategy was to improve training within the NHS for our frontline staff, to be more aware of suicide risks and to be able to assess patients much more effectively as well in doing so. And the data from 2010 shows that at least 50% of our frontline NHS staff have now been educated and trained in using suicide assessment tools and prevention training programmes, and NHS boards are continuing with that ongoing training provision. Presiding Officer, in August this year I also published the Scottish Government's mental health strategy, which sets out a programme over the next 3 years to 5 years around how we intend to improve mental health and well-being in Scotland, and also mental health services in Scotland. Now, there are several elements of that which are relevant to the whole area of reducing suicide, such as working effectively with families and carers, and also increasing support for self-management and self-help approaches. But what we're also doing is undertaking a consultation early in the new year, which will involve a public engagement programme, looking at how we can take forward our new suicide prevention and self-harm strategy in Scotland. We intend to publish that new strategy in the summer of next year, and the working group that's been established in order to take that piece of work forward includes a representative from the Samaritans to assist with that area of work. I've got no doubt that this is an area where we can make much more progress. What we need to do is to make sure that all of the services are working in a coordinated fashion in order to achieve that. Presiding Officer, preventing suicide remains a significant challenge, but the progress we have made in recent years I do believe gives us great encouragement. We have achieved a considerable amount, but there's certainly more that we can do, and the new strategy intends to do that. I've got no doubt that the Samaritans in the coming years will continue to play a valuable role in Scottish society in helping to support those experiencing distress within our society. And again, I'd like to offer my congratulations to Lanarkshire Samaritans on reaching their 40th anniversary, and I wish them the very best for the coming 40 years.
Thank you very much. And that concludes this debate, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.